This is Tell Me What to Read, the podcast of Booktopia.com.au. I'm Nick Wasiliev, and for today's book discussion podcast, I'm joined by Ben Hunter. Hello, Ben.
Hi, Nick.
Scott Whitmont. Hello, Scott.
Hey there, Nick. Belated Happy New Year.
Thank you very much, Scott. And once again, all the way from the UK, the one and only Nick Coveney from Rakuten Kobo. Hey, Nick, how are you?
Hi, Nick. I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me back.
We always love having you back. The pleasure is all ours. So let's dive into the books that we have been reading and enjoying. And I'm going to throw first to Ben. Ben, what have you been enjoying over the last couple of weeks?
Nick, I'm really excited about debut Australian fiction novels. It's a wonderful time of year when new authors just spring into being, and we get to read some new voices and discover new things. A book I've read in recent days that I've just devoured. It just drank this book like a tonic. It just went straight down like a treat. It is called The Torrent by Danuka Mackenzie. It is a Australian police procedural novel. Perfect thing for readers who liked Jane Harper's novels or Sarah Bailey. And it is set in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. There's a flood. There's a death in the flood, and the cause of which is up to answer. And we're introduced to this incredible detective that I just adore. Her name is Kate Miles. She is 8-9 months pregnant, just about to go on leave and explode, and she's running this case. She's also running another case which kind of dovetails into the drowning very slowly and wonderfully, and you know the dots are going to connect, but you don't know how that's going to happen. So she's heavily pregnant. She's a female cop in a rural precinct and she outranks like most of the blokes around her, and so that's a cause of tension in and of itself. She's also of a non-white ethnicity, and then that brings on like a whole other layer of microaggressions from the people she deals with, and in times macroaggressions. So there's just so many layers of stuff going on with her, and she's just an awesome hero. And it's just the most brilliantly put together mystery. It's professional level stuff. I would expect it. If you like Michael Robotham, you could read this. It is like that level, but it's a debut, and it's no surprise that this is a book that won unpublished manuscript prize. It's called the Banjo Prize. It's done by HarperCollins. It's been published by the same publisher that put out Dervla McTiernan's book. So that's like you're onto something good. So if you're a crime lover, if you're an Australian crime lover, The Torrent, Danuka Mackenzie, that's an easy win for me. You'll read it in a heartbeat.
Well, Ben, when we get to my books, it'll be like deja vu, because I also have an Australian debut crime rural setting novel to talk about. So we've both chosen the same today with different books, but the same genre.
I'm loving all of our headspaces in terms of Australian crime. But I will say, Ben, on this book, we've been lucky enough to have do an interview with Danuka, which will be coming out in the next week or so on Tell Me What to Read. And I have not seen you this excited about a debut in a long time. What is it about it? What is it that is really is it just scratching an itch that you didn't know you needed to be scratched? I'm curious.
It's just really, really well done commercial fiction. And it's really well done crime. It's great to have a really well done crime. It's just a pleasure. It's just like there's a reason why that stuff sells and sells and sells. It is a genuinely fulfilling reading experience. It's solid entertainment, and it switches your brain on. And it's it's also just it's great to have someone who's not straight and white and a man publishing in that space, and writing a detective who's not a straight white old man who drinks and fights with people. It's that's a refreshing read for me, and I think people are going to love it. But if you want to see me excited about Australian debut fiction, I mean, this is this other book I brought to kind of yarn about right now is not a debut book per se. This guy has published a poetry collection, but it's a debut novel. All right, it's called Son of Sin. The author is Omar Sakar. He is Lebanese Australian. He's when the publisher gave you this book, it just told me this guy's pretty much written 95% of his life, but kind of made it fiction to make it work as a novel. And it's bloody wild. It is the story of a guy growing up with a fractured but brilliant big family in southwest Sydney, and he has to come to terms with himself as a queer man in an Arab community, which is deeply homophobic and deeply spiritual and deeply superstitious. And it just takes you straight, like unapologetically into the heart of southwest Sydney and a climate of just otherworldliness and aggression and everything that the glossy white Australia that you see on Channel 9 doesn't want you to see. And it's brilliantly done. It's the most lyrically explained way of portraying it as well. If you read Michael Muhammad's novel, The Lebs, I think this will speak to you, right? But it's a completely different tone, and it's a different perspective on that same climate, that same world. And yeah, I was just blown away by this thing from the first pages. It's just it just does it all. It brought to mind so many elements of a culture that I don't understand, and it made them. It kind of illuminated them to me in a way that only fiction can, and it also presented the unsafe world of southwest Sydney, of a deeply multicultural place, and a place that is economically on the edge and constantly made to feel unwelcome, and deep in the heart of just all of the hard questions we have to ask about who we really are as a society, and how integrated and how whole are we. But it's deeply personal, and it does so much in a brief stint of pages. It's a miracle, this thing. I love it.
Ben, the extract I read, you could tell that Omar's background is as a poet, because he writes now in his fiction so lyrically, as a poet you'd expect a poet to. But it also reminded me of another one from a generation ago from Western multicultural Melbourne, and that's Christos Tsiolkas's Loaded, about growing up in the Greek community that didn't accept his being gay, and how his life was coming out in that repressive community and different culture. So I know this one's Muslim Arab community, it's different culture, but it reminded me of that same premise.
No, that's a early Tsiolkas is definitely a really good comp to this. And like Tsiolkas, he has he has a lyricism, he has a voice and a raw talent that is just unique and special. And when you get that in a debut book, that's something that gets you really excited as a reader.
It's just great to hear that there's more stories coming out of this part of Sydney. It's and coming out of this dynamic of Sydney that so many people are not familiar with. So it's I hope that this book does well, because I know it's been on your radar for quite a while, this book, and it sounds incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much, Ben. I love that you're in debut land, and if you stick around to the end as well, we'll be announcing a fun little mini series of podcasts that we'll be doing upcoming in the next few weeks with debut authors as well. So hold that thought. But now I'm going to move on to our guest, to Nick. I know that you've brought a couple of books along today. What have you been enjoying over the last few months?
Well, you'll notice that I'm sticking to my theme. So listeners who've been subjected to me talking about books previously will be aware of that I love reading as queer as possible, and that I always try and sort of skew myself towards LGBTQ plus books when I'm reading for fun. And I've got some brilliant books I can recommend that I've read recently. So the first I wanted to talk about is A Dress Book by Neil Bartlett, which is an incredibly beautiful and very sort of lyrical collection of short stories that looks at sort of intersecting lives of gay men throughout different decades. Neil Bartlett, for those who aren't familiar, is an award shortlisted author here in the UK. He's also a playwright, and he's been writing some incredibly important gay fiction since before I was born, and is really, really compelling and sort of visceral in the way he sort of looks at things. And I don't know if it's been as popular in Australia as it was here, but there was a brilliant TV series that Russell T Davies produced called It's a Sin, that looked at life in London during the emergence of the AIDS crisis, at a time where there was widespread government suppression and persecution of people who we might now define as queer, although at the time that wasn't really the term they would use for themselves. So it's a really, really fascinating book, and it spans, I think, over 100 years in the same place. And there's this recurrent theme of people resorting to their address books for different reasons. So a closeted individual who has a black book of men that he's met, that kind of thing. It's just really, really beautifully done. So I'd recommend that to everyone. And the ebook is very, very affordable. So there is a paperback edition available as well, but it's a great opportunity for people who aren't e-reading yet to give that a go. I think I might have talked about this author before because he's another favorite of mine, but Lev C. Rosen has been writing some incredibly important and very, very compelling LGBTQ YA fiction for several years now. He's the author of Jacket Parts and Other Parts, and one of his latest titles, Camp, is an incredible sort of analysis of a sexually inclusive summer camp for teens who are queer, and it sort of follows the story of some of the characters and friends who attend this camp over several years, and the sort of how they grow up together, how they develop feelings for each other, and how that all gets explored. Really excitingly, this has been optioned by HBO, and Billy Porter is going to direct it. So I feel like I'm giving Booktopia listeners, if they've not heard about this book already, a great heads up, because I'm sure once the HBO series comes out, it will be on everybody's lips. But it's a brilliant story, and it's really, really compelling, and it's exactly the kind of inclusive YA story that I think could literally save kids' lives. So I was really, really delighted to read it. And finally, I wanted to talk about The Spirit Engineer by A.J. West, which is fascinating. It is fiction, but it is based on the true story of William Jackson Crawford, who was an incredibly popular spiritualist in the Victorian era, and rubbed shoulders with Harry Houdini and the like, but sort of died in infamy and committed suicide. And this analyzes his sort of rise to fame and then his sort of falling star in a really, really fascinating way. And I wasn't familiar with William Jackson Crawford at all. He actually was born in New Zealand, I believe, and then came back to the UK. So he had family ties to Scotland and Northern Ireland, and sort of moved around the world at a time when obviously doing so was incredibly dangerous. But there's all sorts of fascinating stuff there, because he was a scientist who got sort of pulled in to the Victorian obsession with spiritualism. And he became connected to the slightly notorious Kathleen Gola. And Gola was a famous medium who was part of the Gola Circle. And again, partly because of his work, William Jackson Crawford sort of raised her up, and they literally went on sort of tours together and did events, seances. And he was attempting to scientifically prove that she was a de facto real deal medium. And then, of course, it emerged, well, all sort of things emerge as the novel progresses. But it's a really, really sort of gorgeously gothic book. So I think people would enjoy that.
So it's well-researched historical fiction based on his life, is it?
Yes, it's very immaculately researched. Obviously, a lot of it is speculative. The sort of personal relationships, the motivations, and the sort of basically the subtext between the known events of William Jackson Crawford's life. But I think it's been immaculately researched and is just a really, really good read. I
love these books that you've brought, and keep this theme up forever. I always love hearing about all fantastic books that you're talking about, especially a dress book. I know that you mentioned that if it was a dress book that was in a similar style to It's a Sin, which I also recommend everyone should watch. I remember growing up with those Russell T story early series like Queer as Folk, hearing about the gay scene in Manchester, which is an incredible series. It's a good question actually to ask here about, because I know that you really are so passionate about LGBT stories and getting them out there. Are you seeing a lot of these stories kind of growing and on the horizon a lot more? Because we've seen the growth of so many fantastic books and points of view that have emerged in the last couple of years, especially here at Booktopia, including and. We had a recent winner for one of our awards being a fantastic story about two gay Indigenous boys called The Boy from the Mish, which I highly recommend you read. Are you seeing a huge push towards stories like that increasingly?
I think that it is beginning to increase over time. Interestingly, I think here in the UK, we might be lagging slightly behind. I think that there are some fantastic authors. I mean, I mentioned before on the podcast, The Outrage by William Hussey. And, there are some other fantastic British and UK-based LGBTQ plus authors. There's more and more of that published. I think finally, publishers might be acknowledging that this is, not just a genre in itself or a sort of niche subset, but actually something that has universal appeal and can be incredibly transformative and important and moving to everybody. And we might be moving beyond, dare I say it, fingers crossed, being a trend, because for several years, particularly when I was publisher side prior to joining Rakuten Kobo, people would talk about diverse books in a sort of tick box exercise way, where there'd be a very, very small subset of a list, or if you were lucky, maybe an entire list, where these get to be our diverse books. And I think that maybe we're moving beyond that now into people finally giving these stories and their authors the credit they deserve. But I do see that, interestingly, there's a lot more speed and a lot more enthusiasm, I think, in terms of embracing that opportunity coming out of North America and even Australia. I think that there are still some very, very talented authors here in the UK, but I have the perception that a lot of the publishing that's coming out is actually being done by independents and smaller publishers as a generalization. It's still the case, I think, where in the UK there isn't as much representation as I would like to see personally.
But I think you're right, Nick. It's gone beyond, as society's moved forward. It's no longer seen as a societal taboo subject for literature that people go, oh, a gay story or an LGBTQ story. It's become the normal experience for so many people in the US, UK, and Australia. That's just a story. They're just stories about life and getting confidence and family and community. And the fact that a main character happens to be LGBTQ plus is kind of irrelevant. You can read as a subgenre, but mainstream, people who just like mainstream fiction and good stories are now reading these books, whereas half a generation ago they're like, oh no, that's not for me, that's for the gay community. It's no longer the case. They're for everyone. They're just stories about people and life. And isn't that great that we've changed like that? Yeah.
I think it's incredibly helpful and positive. The only thing I say is that I just hope that trend, the industry continues to embrace and support these books and their brilliant authors, and that we see that being furthered. I think here in the UK we've got some really sort of scary political stuff that's still rumbling on. So whereas other countries have properly banned conversion therapy, I think the last time I spoke to you all, this was being talked about. Our government decided to run a consultation for all voices to talk about conversion therapy and how it might or might not be banned. And they decided, because they didn't feel that the initial window is big enough, to extend that. So we're still in a consultation period where members of the public, including those who don't like LGBTQ plus people, can comment on whether or not we should be protected from coercive, abusive, so-called conversion therapy, and what that protection might or might not look like, and what any exceptions to that might look like, which basically is a way of allowing people who don't like us, who are prejudiced against us, to talk about how we shouldn't be protected, which is quite alarming, really.
Slightly changing the subject, but not. In the same way, I think we've seen a big growth and change in Australian literature in recent years of stories about Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginal community, and when I was reading a few decades ago, you could count on your fingers the stories that were based on, Indigenous stories. And now there's so many wonderful Australian Indigenous authors and stories about the Indigenous community. So I think it's a lot of groups in the community now being written about in a mainstream way, which is very healthy.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well that what has traditionally been seen as minority stories are being brought forward, and I think it's important and invaluable that continues to happen. And fingers crossed it does going forward. But I will say that the best stories that we've kind of seen over the last couple of years have ones that have talked about these subjects and challenged these subjects. So hopefully, onwards and upwards for this. I say onwards and upwards. Thank you so much, Nick. I love hearing your recommendations every single time you come on the show, and this is no exception. Thank you so much. Before we head on to Scott for our final recommendations, we are in fact sponsored. We have a sponsored book for this week, and our sponsored book is Beau Miles' The Backyard Adventure audiobook. So after years of adventuring around the globe, running, kayaking, hitchhiking, exploring, Beau Miles came back to his country block in country Victoria. Staying put for the first time in years, Beau developed this new kind of lifestyle as the backyard adventurer, whether it be walking 90 kilometres to work with no provisions, building a canoe paddle out of scavenged scrap, or running a disused railway line through properties, blackberry thickets, and past police officers. Beau has been finding ways to satisfy his adventurous spirit close to home. This book is about conscious experimentation with adventure, making meaning and inspiration out of tins of beans, rubbish, and elbow grease. Beau's backyard exploits are funny, authentic, insightful, and have been copied all over the world. The audiobook is out now, and you'll be able to check out a sneaky snippet of it right here.
In the final furlong to home, mashed up in a cross-section of what I saw were ruminations on my so-called adventurous life, which is really an ongoing debate about my sense of perception. Back on the deck at home, half nude as I acclimatised from the heat and movement of running for 3 hours, I slowly ate chickpeas from the tin, which is a rare speed of eating for me. I'm thinking with scepticism about being an adventurer, engaging in daring and risky activities in unfamiliar places, often with only a hint of the expertise required to be there. Much like my wariness of real estate agents, I've seemed to gloss over the truth with half-truths, pitching stories as audacious, unable to see that so many other people do things tougher, riskier, more challenging, perhaps even more rewarding in far less publicised ways. There is truth to the idea that I like seeing what lurks in hard-to-reach places, and I might be plucky and enterprising, which fits the bill of adventure. But brave and heroic should never be keywords of my films, in my bio, or anything else associated to me. More than that, these bold terms of adventure should be questioned. I say this because at various stages I've unwittingly bought into that mindset and looked at maps and charts as if I were a conqueror, out to beat the world. Day 3 without showering, in need of a haircut and shave, about to leave the house to buy milk, I was in fact on the comfortable side of an identity crisis, having come to terms with the fact that I was not the man I thought I was. Such a breakthrough in thinking is to acknowledge that I have a uniqueness born of influences, which seems a little more scripted than innate, including summer camps and universities, stinking male-only share houses, roadside diners, expeditions, films, women, family. I am flawed and oscillate between being mildly and intensely curious about our world. And that makes me and my newish, ongoing, close-to-home trips interesting. Rather than loading up with expensive gadgets and upskilling to the point of perfection, I'm setting off in the full knowledge that I'm weighed down with metaphorical baggage, so my aim now is to take as little real equipment as possible. Where I go and where I might end up are a little shady, and research from the bottomless pit of Google is often lacking. Before I begin, let me be clear, as my great flaw is impatience. This is not a guidebook for the good life, nor will I preach about the importance of challenge and epiphanies, hardship and breakthroughs. Backyard adventuring is about concocting meaningful events and experiments that challenge me, that redefine my childhood sense of the hero's journey, that force me to look intimately in everyday places and question how I live among others. Ultimately, it's about being pissed off enough to take care of myself, others and non-human life, and happy enough not to let myself, others and non-human things bother me all the time. Balance between firing myself up and wetting myself down is the great act of perception I'm taking on. Quite simply, this book is a set of stories told by a red-headed bloke who has redefined his sense of adventure.
That was Beaumile's audiobook version of The Backyard Adventurer, and it is our sponsored book of the week. Interesting to note, it also came in number 3 overall in the Booktopia 2021 Fab Award, which was unveiled yesterday, which is an incredible achievement. So be sure to check that book out. All right, we move on to our final guest of the show, and that is none other than Scott Whitmont. Hello, Scott. Please tell me what you've been enjoying over the last few weeks.
But just for 30 seconds before I do, I just want to endorse the book of the week because I've read it, and it's so entertaining. And so whether you want to listen to the new audiobook or read the book, if you don't know Beaumiles, go to his channel, to go put in Beaumiles on YouTube. His videos are hysterically funny of all his adventures, which are now put into the book in book form, but very entertaining. So I really recommend that. But that's not one of my review ones. That's just me endorsing our sponsored book of the week. As usual, I tend to have gotten to the habit of doing one fiction and one non-fiction, and so I'm continuing in that theme, like Nick is continuing in his theme. And my fiction one I'll start with perhaps because Ben, as I said earlier, spoke about a similar one. It's a debut crime fiction, and it's called The Cane, and it's by Mary Rose Cuskelly, and it also came out this week. She's not a debut author. She's written a number of non-fiction, but this is her first novel. And like Ben's book, it's set in rural Australia and very evocatively written a novel of landscape and place in the same way as The Dry or Scrublands. Any who like that genre will love this too. It's set in far north Queensland in the sugarcane area in a fictional town called Quayla, and it's set in the 1970s. And Janet McClymont is a 16-year-old girl who's in the local community, and she sets off from home to walk the 20 minutes or so to the neighbours to do some babysitting through the cane fields, and she never arrives at the babysitting. What's happened to her? She's disappeared. So this mystery is what happened to Janet. They look for her body through the cane field. Her mother wants them to stop the annual burning of the cane in case her body's there in the middle of the cane field. She doesn't want it to be, burnt. So they're searching there, but maybe she wasn't killed. Maybe she was kidnapped, or maybe she just ran off to Brisbane to seek another life and was a runaway teenager. What is it? I won't spoil it by telling you, but the mystery is what happened to Janet. And while the police are looking into it, and again, Ben, like yours, it's a female policeman, a policewoman who the country town's not used to, who comes in to investigate. And there's all sorts of subplots. There's a suspect teacher in the high school who's handing out copies of the Little Red School Book, which was distributed in the 70s, that outraged particularly conservative and rural areas at the time, because it encouraged kids to look into drugs and sex and how they felt about themselves. It's nothing now, but in the 70s that was really outrageous. And he's handing out copies to his students, so everyone just thinks he's a bit sus. And there was a murder or a death in decade before, and is it related perhaps to Janet's disappearance? It may or may not be. There's lots of mysteries and subplots, but you get the whole politics and society of a small town where everybody knows everybody else's business. It's very Australian, as I said, evocative of place, wonderful characters, and all the way through you think, oh, I think I know what happened, and of course you don't. You keep changing your mind, and you never guess until you find out at the denouement, which is when they're burning finally burning the cane fields as they need to, and the proverbial hits the fan with a great, exciting denouement of the book, which is very exciting. So I really recommend, if you like, just like Ben's book, if you like Australian crime, good mystery, rural fiction, Australian fiction, Mary Rose Cuskelly's The Cane. So that's the first. The second one is a biography called The Duchess Who Dared, the life of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll. You might know of her, Nick, I don't know. She's one of your lot over there. This book came out actually in the 90s, but it's been republished in a new edition because of the BBC television production called A Very British Scandal, which just came out at the end of the year. I don't think that's shown in Australia yet. It'll be on Amazon Prime sometime this year. But that is a story that's based on the life of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll. So who the hell was she? She was a society figure and a model. She was very beautiful through the 1930s and 40s. She was born in 1912. She came from Scotland. Her father was a very wealthy man, and she was really a nymphomaniac socialite. She's, it's very gossipy. It's a great story of her life, but it's a sad story too. She married initially when she was very young, and she had 2 kids. She married a very wealthy businessman and got divorced after some time. But the main story is the story of her second marriage. The controversy in her life is when she married Ian Campbell, who was the 11th Duke of Argyll. And he didn't have a very good reputation. He was addicted to prescription drugs. He was alcoholic. He was a gambler. He'd been married twice before, and his 2 previous wives had described him as violent and sadistic and emotionally cruel. So perhaps this marriage was doomed to failure from the beginning, and it certainly didn't last very long. She was accused by her husband of cheating on him, and the trial ended up being one of the longest and most expensive trials in the Scottish courts in Edinburgh, when they had the divorce trial. And his evidence was he'd had a locksmith break into a cupboard in her home and found Polaroid pictures and diaries where she wrote about various men she'd had quote-unquote adventures with, and the list was more than 80 men. So he accused her of... what's the word?
Adultery.
That's the word I'm looking for. I'm so innocent, I don't know these words. He accuses her of adultery with over 80 men. But the Polaroids were the most shocking because they showed her wearing absolutely nothing but her 3-strand pearl necklace that she was known to wear. And one of them, she's on her knees on the floor, and it became a famous gossip about photo, the headless man, because you don't know who it was, but she was kneeling in front of him performing a certain act, and there was a Polaroid photo of that, and there was suspicion that it might have been Douglas Fairbanks Jr., or it might have been the son-in-law of Winston Churchill, and it's never been revealed to this day. Nobody knows who it was, but that was the huge controversy and gossip at the time. And of course, the Duke of Argyll won the case. They were divorced, and she was... everybody turned their backs on her, all her friends, all of society, because she was the fallen woman who, it's okay if a guy has lots of mistresses, but if a woman sleeps with lots of men, that's just a no-no, certainly in the 50s and 60s. And she lost all her money. She ended up having to move from her mansion to a hotel suite just with one maid, the poor thing. But then after some time, she was thrown out of the hotel for non-payment of the bill, and had to, her family ended up putting her in a retirement or nursing home, where she died when she was 80 years old, absolutely penniless. But she was really, because of the scandal, she was really pilloried in society and in the press, and it would have been an internet scandal had there been internet at the time, but of course there wasn't. And her life is just fascinating. My favorite quote of hers, or actually not quote of hers, quote about her, is she wrote a memoir that I think was ghostwritten and was very badly reviewed at the time she wrote it. And one reviewer said, her father may have been able to give her some fine earrings, but nothing to put between them. So she wasn't known for her intellect or intelligence, but she was known for her beauty and her scandalous activities. I know, it's quite savage. So if you like a bit of goss, it was really good. The judge said in his judgment, she was a completely promiscuous woman, and her attitude to marriage was wholly immoral. So nothing like a bit of scandal. And I didn't know much about her, so it's a very interesting read. The author, Charles Castle, actually passed away a few years ago himself. As I said, it was originally published in the 90s, but he based his book on hours of interviews he did with her in retirement. He went and interviewed her about her life, and then after she died, he wrote this biography. So if you see a very British scandal on television, whether you do or you don't, it's a really interesting life if you like societal history or the English aristocracy. The Duchess Who Dared, the life of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll. There you go.
Are you familiar with this story, Nick?
Very British scandal indeed.
I am indeed. She's as Scott alluded to, notorious in British high society. So even before the TV series aired, I was aware of her, just partly because of that sort of very dated patriarchal response to adultery. I think, there's some really fascinating segments to her life that don't get talked about. She had, I believe, some very, very tempestuous early relationships before she was married, and she was actually married twice. So the Duke is the sort of like the big headline one, because that's the marriage where it all went wrong for her and it all sort of imploded around her. But I think that she was sort of subjected to some really reprehensible people, and raised up on a plinth on one hand for her incredible beauty, but then punished for enjoying her own sexual appetite and daring to have one at a time where such thoughts were far beyond acceptable. And her, as Scott mentioned again, like it was fine for husbands to have multiple mistresses, or dalliances as they'd be called. And I think there's been a lot of portrayals in things like The Crown of the fact that perhaps even the royal family might not have been as chaste and virtuous as their wedding vows would have you believe. But, you know, certainly for a high society flyer like her, she flew too close to the sun, and then the press and high society gloried in her downfall. Yes. And then I think her memoir was savage for a range of reasons, but the main thing was people didn't like how many names she dropped, and probably didn't like how many people were being implicated. You know, I'm sure it was heavily ghostwritten, and I haven't read it, but I just know that it was called Forget Not. And I think it basically was almost like a little black book of various, you know, you said that there's that one very infamous Polaroid where the
headless man.
The headless man, the gentleman never identified himself for various reasons. But, you know, I think that the main issue people had with her autobiography was she didn't shy away from giving quite a few telling details there that would allow people to put, you know, join the dots as to which husbands might have been unfaithful to their wives.
The two other little bits of trivia about her is her first scandal was she actually had an abortion because she got pregnant at the age of 15 to an 18-year-old David Niven, the actor, and she actually stayed friendly with him to the end of his life, and her parents were outraged and sent her off to have an abortion because she had this affair with him when she was 15 and got pregnant. And her daughter-in-law, or her son's ex-wife, is the rather odious Lady Colin Campbell, who you sometimes see on TV talking about British society and the royals, who I think is an odious character. But Lady Colin Campbell, who's written a few books and is on TV often, married for a brief time her son. So there you go. Scandal in multiple generations of that family.
Oh, blimey. This sounds like a very juicy book. It's got lots of goss.
And if you're interested in her life, I might just mention in passing, there was another very good biography of her that came out a few years ago called The Grit in the Pearl, The Scandalous Life of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll by Lindsay Spence, which is a different one to the one I've just read, but it's also a very, very good one with a slightly different perspective. So 2 books on her, The Grit in the Pearl and The Duchess Who Dared.
I'll just also quickly add, and I think you were going to touch on this as well, Ben, the cane that you mentioned first, your first book. Ben, you've had the chance to check this book out as well, haven't you?
No, I'm just about to read it. I've just had a look at the first chapter, and I've heard good things about this book from so many people. I'm not surprised that you were wrapped in it, Scott. It sounds great. I read the first chapter, and it presents this image of a mother who's going about town buying up all of the butane lighters and all of the matches and just standing and striking them till they're black and they're gone, because she doesn't want the farmers in this community to burn the cane and destroy the remains of her daughter.
Yes. For those who might be, if anyone's interested to read my review of it, it's actually on the Booktopia blog. You can see my review of that book.
I'll be sure to chuck a link to it down in the description box of this podcast, so you can check it out for yourself if you are listening. Thank you so much, Scott. Amazing recommendations as always. I love your fiction. I love your historical examinations. I love your non-fiction. Love it all. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this podcast for this week. Thank you, Scott, and thank you all for your fantastic recommendations. It's been a blast hearing from all of you. You can find links to all of the books mentioned in this podcast in the description, or also you can go to a beautiful website called booktopia.com.au. It's a damn good website. Lots of books. Hell of a lot of books there. So please go check it out. Buy books there. Literally helps keep this podcast running. So be sure to check that out. Additionally, you can also check out many of the partnerships and programs that we're doing with Rakuten Kobo. So including falling in love this February with a huge range of romance audiobooks for under $10 for a limited time. You can go check that out now. I'll include links to that sale in the description. But you can also check out a whole bunch of exclusive bundles on Kobo e-readers, including the Kobo Nia, Libra, Kobo Clara, and more, again, which you can also get from Booktopia. Thank you especially to Nick for joining us from the other side of the world. It's been a pleasure having you as always.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been brilliant, guys. Always a pleasure.
So you can join us next week for a series as we begin, as mentioned across this podcast. We will begin a special mini series of podcasts, Date with a Debut, where our one and only Ben Hunter will sit down with debut authors from across Australia's literary landscape. We'll be kicking off this mini series by chatting with Danuka McKenzie, author of Torrent, which has been discussed today, as well as Mary Rose Coskelly, the author of The Cane, which also was mentioned in today's podcast. As always, thanks so much for listening, and never stop reading.